All right, terms like the post-war consensus and the rules-based international order, these are terms that are getting thrown around a lot more now. And the reason why they're getting thrown around is because this is more or less what the Western civilization has operated under. This has been kind of the international order that has governed our behavior for about 80 years. So when we talk about the post-war consensus, we're talking about World War II. And what do we mean by that? Well, essentially it's how do we prevent another world war from taking place? And there were certain rules, certain ideas that were put into place that range from everything from what justified actually going to war to Karl Popper's idea of an open society and its enemies and what does that mean? But a lot of it was based around, again, just trying to prevent certain tragedies that had taken place. And today what we're going to discuss is, did it work? Was it valuable for its time, and has it simply outlived its usefulness? Is it something that we need to hold on to and try to protect and preserve going forward? Because one thing is not being questioned right now, and that is it's starting to break. The whole international order that we have more or less lived under for 8 decades is starting to break. And the question is, what is going to replace it? All of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I'm your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Okay, so let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's answer first and foremost, like, what is the post-war consensus? And we've kind of got this broken down into what does it mean for domestic politics, foreign policy, economics. Like, what do we mean when we talk about post-war consensus? Go ahead, Christian.
So, long story short, it's a set of ideas that govern more or less the way that we act within the world that became popular after 1945. And so it's a break from the past. And not just a break from the recent past, right, of the chaos and destruction of the early 20th century, but also a break from what came before the 20th century. And so we came up with a couple of bullet points when we started doing the research for this podcast that I think really encapsulate this. And so if you don't mind, I guess we'll just go through it and then...
Yeah, these are the criteria which describes the post-war consensus.
So first point that we've got on the domestic front is that nations must be secular and follow a hard separation between church and state. Now, that's actually a summarization of a similar point that another individual, Dave Green, actually came up with in a recent debate that he put forward with the X account Local Distance. Local Distance has a large following on Twitter, and they debated the post-war consensus, and one of the points that Dave Green brought up was actually this point. And he points out, no pun intended, that this is a huge break from the past.
Well, and keep in mind, when we say this hard separation of church and state, people are going to be like, what are you talking about? There's all kinds of, look at all of Islam. It's like, yes, the post-war consensus has not been universally adopted by everybody. But if you look at a combination of the major powers, and if you look at what the West has determined is the ideal, separation of church and state is a Western concept that is pretty much universal. Like I can't think of a single major Western country that hasn't adopted this political principle for its domestic politics. And to your point, that was not the case a relatively short, like 1 century ago. That was not the case.
Well, I mean, at this point, you could say 1 century ago, a lot of Western European states had started to secularize, right? But certainly 200 years ago, before the French Revolution, that was very much not the case.
It was the norm.
And when we talk about, it's important to understand, when we talk about the post-war consensus, we are mostly talking about the West.
Yeah.
Now, you can argue since the collapse of the Soviet Union, this is also applied now increasingly to Eastern Europe, although there's instances where this has been resisted. You can point to Hungary, Poland, certainly what's going on with Russia and Ukraine might be a potential example of this. But just understand that we're talking about mostly, you know, European, the United States, Canada, Australia, what we call the West, right?
200 years ago, Europe would have been considered part of Christendom. And today, that's not even a concept within most countries with few exceptions.
The last point I want to say on this is that this is also even a distinction between the historical and the American sense conception of what we would call separation between church and state. When the Founding Fathers are writing the First Amendment into the Bill of Rights, there was still this idea that religion had a role to play within the government sphere. It was instead this idea that we did not want the state to be determining the state religion, because then you might bring back the, again, you know, European wars of religion into the United States.
Well, there was two components. There was the practical consideration where it's like, if you are, this is where Jefferson gets into his whole concept of conscience. If you're forcing a man to violate that which he believes is sacred, you compel him to go to war. And so from the moral perspective, and this is largely informed by Christianity, by the way, it's you cannot force convert, right? You cannot force convert. That is not a biblical principle. And the moment you give state-sponsored favor, you are requiring someone to use their time or their resources to elevate a faith system or the sacred that they might not agree with, and that is something that stirs people toward conflict. So there was both a moral and a practical component to this idea of separation in church and state.
And this is a big difference. The post-1945 manifestation of this is more in line with the French tradition of separation of church and state than the English or American tradition.
Yeah, the French tradition was basically, it was
hard secularism.
So yeah, I think it's important to understand that the English and U.S. tradition was this idea that religion plays a very important role. You see John Adams saying things like, our Constitution is written for a moral and religious people and totally unsuited to any other. That is not what you got. The French Revolution was hostile toward kind of religion. They try to set up their own secular humanist religions. And the point we're saying is that post 1945, you actually saw this diversion more toward the French Revolution interpretation rather than the American Revolution.
So the next point that we've got here, I also pulled from the first 3 points I pulled from Dave Smith, and then the subsequent ones I've pulled from other areas. The next point is nations are collections of individuals, not groups, under a government. Now, this is actually best embodied by a famous quote from Margaret Thatcher, of all people. Thatcher said, while she was prime minister, she famously gave a speech where she said, there are no collections, there is no society, there's just individuals and families. And that is a direct manifestation of the post-war consensus from what we would call a neoliberal perspective rather than necessarily a progressive perspective.
Mm-hmm.
But Thatcher's argument was, and she was debating socialists on this, her argument is that there is no society at all. And she's in a way taking almost a Bastiat approach on this, because she's trying to say if there is a society, then that implies that there's collective responsibilities to that society, and she thinks that this opens the door to socialism.
Yes.
And so she argues that no, there's no such thing as society, there's just individuals, and then there's just families, and then they can come together and vote and form a government maybe, but there is no, this idea of society is a myth.
And this is another thing that's, again, the classical liberal reasoning for this is the idea of trying to protect individual liberty. If you want to look at the Christian component of it, it's this idea that each individual is made in the image of God. And so there's this certain degree of the sacred of the individual, right? Bodily autonomy, things like that. However, that is a major departure where people were largely coalesced around particular groups, usually either in the kind of the more tribal component, which would be more family oriented or extended family oriented, and then the other was the more ethnic component, where it's like this is you had
a shared history, race, culture,
which was
tradition.
largely determined by your ethnic status, right? And there was exceptions to that. I mean, you had like the Roman Empire was very, very good at incorporating people in and having a Roman identity that was not directly tied to ethnicity, but the idea that was the norm throughout most of human history was not the case.
The next point is definitely something that did not exist between 1945, and you can argue it didn't even really blossom until the 1960s, which is unlimited sexual freedom. Mm-hmm. This point cannot be stressed enough that this is new in the grand scheme of history. This definitely did not exist before the 40s. I would argue it did not exist until the 60s.
I think two things caused it to exist, right? One of it was a massive shift we saw in the sexual revolution in the 60s, but that was fueled by greater access to birth control and greater access to abortion in the 70s, where now all of a sudden, theoretically what we had done is, or the way the argument went is, we had liberated women from essentially the constraining components of pregnancy. And so therefore, because women were no longer in danger of getting pregnant simply by engaging in sexual expression, now we had equality between the sexes, and therefore we should make love, not war, and everything else. So there was this component of sexual, but again, I will say that's I think that one is not quite, it has been a manifestation of the post-war consensus, but it wasn't necessarily a direct line. I wouldn't say it had to go in this direction. I think Marxism had a lot to do with it, among some other things, but there's no question that if you go almost anywhere in the West, and really only in the West for the most part,
you're going to find, the audience is going to find out as we go through these points that these values have become the new Western values.
Yeah.
They have the argument that's being put forward here is that these have replaced traditional conceptions of what we would call Western values. These are the new Western values that, basically emerged after 1945. And again, some of these points you can argue came about a little bit later than 1945, but all of them date back basically to 1945. And when you look at the history of the West, broadly speaking, Europe and the United States and Canada, you could also argue, Australia, New Zealand, maybe.
Yeah, we got a couple more domestic points to get through here. Liberal democracy is the only legitimate system. Again, that can manifest itself in different ways, but essentially, if you don't have a representative government with universal suffrage, the West considers that to be problematic. That is a bad thing. The neutral state, pluralism, tolerance, procedural justice. This one's interesting too because the tolerance component, which is something that's going to feature in here pretty broadly, is kind of this larger idea where you might say one manifestation of that is, hey, I can do whatever I want as long as it's not hurting anybody else, right? That's tolerance. But there's some problems with that. The procedural justice component is this idea of justice being blind, and we have due process.
Rawlsian veil of ignorance.
But there's also a positive manifestation of the whole idea of due process of law, right? One of the important thing to understand about the post-war consensus is it's not all bad. There's positive manifestations, negative manifestations, but there was this goal of achieving equality before the law that was rooted in this due process system, right? So if something happens, we all kind of understand the legal process that will be followed with the attempt to try to get to a just result. And then finally, the human rights are about the freedom to choose and the freedom from harm. This is important because human rights in the American tradition in 1776 was the idea of being free from government oppression. It was not being free from harm. It was being free from the government arbitrarily choosing to either give you benefits or punish you based off of your status apart from your actions, right? It could have been your birth. It could have been where you came from, like whatever it was. But it was this idea that human freedom was rooted in this idea that the government was there to protect your God-given rights or your natural rights. But then you saw this significant change that started to happen around the progressive era and really fully launched in the United States during the Great Depression, where it's like, no, government's responsibility is to make sure that you are free from harm. And harm ended up becoming a very, very broad definition.
And even freedom to choose, and this is something that you and I have talked about occasionally. I think Karl Benjamin did a really good job of explaining what he calls comprehensive liberalism.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, it gets into the critique of to what degree has classical liberalism given birth to that, but he points out that comprehensive liberalism, which is actually something that people like Rawls and Locke are warning about, is this idea that the only thing that can exist is individual choice. And if you haven't willingly chosen that, then that thing is oppressive and needs to be torn down. And so that's why I included freedom to choose in here, because if you define it as just freedom to choose, well, there's plenty of things out there that you didn't choose who your family was, you didn't choose what your nation was, you didn't choose what language you spoke. Like, there's a lot of things.
This is where we also get the concept of privilege, right? Because there are a number of things that are beyond your control.
Yeah, I didn't choose my race, my gender, my my status that I was born into, and it feeds into the progressive notion of privilege. So those are really the 6 points that I think define. And again, there might be people that will quibble on the margins of this, right? But
if you were asking someone in the West, what are the kind of the foundations of a Western country that make it both good, right, or desirable and Western, these things would probably get tolerance, freedom, equal justice before the law, representative democracy. These are things that they would say, these are good, like universal goods, right, within a domestic sense. Now in the foreign policy,
we have the idea that they're universal goods, but again, elements of this predated arguably 1945, but it was after 1945 that we kind of decided these are universal goods that define the West. And that's on the domestic front. On the foreign policy front, here's the subsequent points that we've got here. First one, and this is absolutely the most important. is that foreign policy is now dictated and it's dedicated to bringing about what Francis Fukuyama calls the end of history.
Yeah, I hate that term.
The universalizing of liberal democracy.
Yeah, I hate that term. Like, I understand what he's getting at. He's this idea that for most of human history, you had competing theories and cultures and whatnot, and there was conflict and conquest and everything else. And the idea was going to be is that this new international-based order was we were all gradually moving toward universal liberal democracy, and therefore there would be no more invasions, there would be no more wars over religion or whatnot, because everybody would have their respective space, and they would be living in liberal democracies, and they'd have representative government, and they'd be free. And so no need to conquest in the name of God or conquest itself, because we've fixed all that.
This is also why sometimes you get people calling this the Cold War consensus.
Yeah.
Because Fukuyama wrote his book basically immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the argument, at the time in the 90s, this sounded like a very compelling argument. The argument is that liberalism had first triumphed over monarchy in the 19th century, arguably 18th century as well, right? It had first triumphed over monarchy in the United States and in continental Europe, and then it had triumphed over fascism in World War II, and then it had triumphed over communism during the Cold War. And so by the time you get to the 1990s, there's this conception that, yeah, on the margins, you still have, communist China and North Korea and Cuba, but communism is a spent force. Fascism was already defeated in World War II, and monarchies are gone. Yeah. And so liberalism is the last man standing. It won out, and the argument
within a 100-year period, all of a sudden, you within 100 years, like liberal democracy, right, had gone from, I won't say the peripherals, but it had gone from being one of many options to essentially the only option. Yeah. So that again, even though I don't think he was ultimately correct in his analysis, it's not hard to see why this just seemed like an unstoppable juggernaut. And of course, it's just going to, who wouldn't want this thing that keeps winning? Yeah.
So how do you bring about the end of history and the universalizing of liberal democratic values around the world? Well, you do it through nation building and regime change, right? So that's the means in order to achieve that end of history. That's the second point here under the foreign policy. Now, what's going to be the driving force behind regime change and nation building? Well, it's going to be the American-led international order. So this is where you get NATO, the UN, World Bank.
Well, and America is essentially the leader of the Western world by virtue of we have the most powerful military, we have the most powerful economy, and it's not close. This is another thing that I don't think people look at, like peer states. What we call peer states is, this is another first world country. They're part of the G7 or whatnot. There's no comparison, people. There's just none, right? Our GDP is $30 trillion a year, and ours is the only military in the world that can project the kind of force that we do, right? The rest of the EU combined, right, can't do what we do. So it's important to understand that. And this also leads into the idea of a rules-based international order, which, again, you can be very sympathetic to, is this idea that, okay, what are the rules which govern international relations in order to prevent war? And a big part of the motivation behind that, too, is now that we have nuclear powers, World War II was bad enough. Now add even more nukes than Hiroshima and Nagasaki to World War II, and you get an existential crisis for the entire world. You actually get what was theorized as extinction level events. And so it was like, okay, in order to prevent this potentially extinction level event, we got to set up really, really, strong rules for international order. And one of those was you don't invade other countries. You respect territorial boundaries. And if you don't respect those territorial boundaries, there will be both economic and military consequences. And that's where you saw, like, again, Iraq goes into Kuwait. 200 years ago, nobody would have cared. It would have been like, and what's for dinner, right? It must be a Tuesday. One country invaded another country. But all of a sudden, it was this big deal that you don't do that. And if anybody does it, it's America. And because when America does it, we don't seize territory, because that's another one of the international rules, is that whatever boundaries are currently in place, those are the boundaries. And you actually saw this with, like, Colin Powell. He gave his very impassioned speech when he was talking about Normandy. It's like the Americans have fought on a number of continents and asked for no more territory than what we required to bury our dead. And there's a lot of truth to that. The vast majority of major wars the United States has fought, we've taken no territory. Doesn't mean we couldn't have. We didn't.
Because since the Spanish-American War.
Yes, yeah, but that's over 100 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. Right? That was before 1945.
Yeah, World War I, we didn't take territory. World War II, we didn't take territory. Like, it's important to understand that would have been seen as absurd throughout all of history, all the way up until this international rules base. But the United States took this leadership role that we were going to be the ones that maintained borders as they were in order to prevent larger scale conflicts.
I feel like that was a big mistake, and we should have been taking that territory.
Well, hang on. We're going to get, once again, Tina is jumping ahead to pointing out the flaws with it. Don't worry, Tina. We're going to be, as Nick pointed out, like, there are potentially a few things in here.
Tina's over here like, I want to be queen of more than the bees.
No, I just think that a lot less countries would be screwing around with us if we made them find out.
Well, I mean, in a way, Trump is upsetting the apple cart on
we'll get to that.
But we'll get to that. Like,
international institutions. So UN, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, central banks, as apolitical technocratic stabilizers. So this also has to do with like the United States being the world's reserve currency. Mm-hmm. The world being the world's reserve currency gives you an incredible amount of power over commerce.
See, now it's Nick that's jumping ahead.
Well,
I actually have that as I have that as a point under when we get to economic.
Yeah.
But to your point, a lot of these things interlock with each other. Yeah. As you notice as we go through them, a lot of them bleed into the next one and create this, kind of self-fulfilling chain. The last point that I want to touch on when it comes to foreign policy, really speaks to the beginning of this post-war consensus in 1945, because you get to the edgelords, the ones who are rebelling against the post-war consensus without really any conception of morality, and so they're just doing a negation, and so then they end up LARPing as Nazis on Twitter.
Yeah.
And you get the edgelords that call it the Nuremberg consensus, and the reason why is because historically, when you had conflicts, it was under the Westphalian system. It was, you had nation states that had absolute sovereignty within their borders. They determined the rules within their boundaries, and then occasionally they would engage in conflicts with other nation states. Mm-hmm. And when you got to peace deals, it would be one nation state adjudicating that peace to another nation state, depending on how the conflict played out, right? But now, conflicts are not waged from a perspective of a sovereign nation state engaging in what is in the best interest of that sovereign nation state and then adjudicating that peace through that lens. Instead, the conflict is waged in the name of humanity, in the name of liberating people, in the name of conceptions of human rights. So, for example, when we tried the Nazis at Nuremberg, we did not do it in the sense of victor's justice, right? We won, you lost, we're just going to impose our will on.
We appealed to a moral authority.
We convicted them not in the name of you waged war with us and you lost, therefore we're going to kill you or imprison you or whatever. Instead, it's you committed crimes against humanity.
Yeah.
And so in a way, what we did was, maybe inadvertently, but what we did is that we substituted the Westphalian system, absolute nation-state sovereignty, to a higher set of liberal principles, in this case, human rights, democracy.
Well, and let's say why I think the reason why they call it the Nuremberg Consensus is because the Westphalian Order was your nation state, your rules. So when Nazis got up there and said, I was just following orders, that's kind of an appeal to the Westphalian, tradition. And when they said, but is there not a higher order? It's like, ooh, because now that's kind of a difficult thing that we'll talk about later, because when you say, is there not a higher order, you are appealing to objective morality. You're essentially saying that your state's laws...
And there's a contradiction that's in
there.
And
there's a big contradiction in there when we get to their whole tolerance component. But essentially, that changed things. And now the idea of I want to conquer that because I want it is considered completely illegitimate. And by the way, there's a good moral reason why it's considered completely illegitimate, right?
Well, that's why anytime people do start... anytime somebody's drumming up the whole anti-war, not the anti-war right necessarily, it's usually the anti-war left.
Yeah.
They'll be like, oh, we're only going there to take resources. We're only going there because of oil. We're only going, we're owned by OPEC. Whatever it is, we're just trying to get cheaper prices on this resource or that resource. But when you think about it, it's like, we should be trying to get the best price possible for America.
Okay, but the idea is that they're trying to say that if war is conducted for nothing more in order to achieve better economic conditions to yourself at the expense of someone else, how is that different than theft?
And that's totally understandable, except that every single war has been that we've found ourselves in, whether Congress voted on it or not. Whoever was sending us to war had this humanitarian purpose for it, and they would drum that up. But under the surface, everybody kind of knew they were just going to go.
But that's not necessarily true. Actually, that's a big distinction between the way the wars were fought before and the way that wars have been fought predominantly in the 20th and 21st century. When we went to Iraq, we could have just taken all the oil. Like, that was one of the things that frustrated me about the.
No, I understand.
Well, wait a second.
If it was for those reasons, that's what we would have done. It's just what I'm saying is the anti-war people always try to find, oh, well, they're really doing it because of this, whatever this thing
as if
is.
two things can't be true.
They're actually, they might not realize it, but a lot of the anti-war left, when they show up, are appealing to the post-war consensus as their justification for arguing against military action. The anti-war right usually does not appeal to that. It usually appeals to national self-interest.
Sovereignty. Yeah, national sovereignty. Yeah.
Okay. We got one more to go here on this one, and that's the economic side. But before we get to that, I'll tell you where there is a post-war consensus that we can all get behind, and that is Good Ranchers is awesome. That's right. You can go right now, and you can get some of the most delicious beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood ever. And ladies and gentlemen, July 4th is coming up. Right? If you want to celebrate America, you do that at a grill. You do that at a grill while you're setting off explosions. So go over to goodranchers.com, use my exclusive code Nick, and you're not only going to get 40%, you're not only going to get $40 off. You're going to get free meat with your subscription. Right? So you're going to be able to go on there. You're going to be able to pick what sort of good American-raised beef, pork, poultry, and wild-caught seafood that you're going to have for your 4th of July celebration. Go over there to goodranchers.com. Use that code Nick. And check. I'm telling you, we eat Good Ranchers almost every day. We absolutely love it. It is great quality. None of the crap that is getting injected into other meats that you just go randomly buy at the store. Go over there. It gets delivered to your door. You don't even got to worry about it. Go right now. And just try it out for 4th of July. I promise you're not going to be disappointed. GoodRanchers.com. Use my code Nick. Okay, so the third component here, so we've talked about the domestic, we've talked about the foreign, now we get into the economic. This is where we get into, where I kind of jumped ahead, the Washington Consensus. That's globalization, deregulation, free trade, free markets. I'm going to push back a little bit on this, right? I think it's generally true that the post-war consensus, I don't think they free trade to a degree.
Free trade really picked up after like Bretton Woods. That's why we made the dollar the reserve currency.
Free trade to a degree.
Not the only
The other thing too is that it's this idea of free markets. No, what the consensus was is that communism failed, and so what most Western societies actually went after was capitalism with a very, very large social welfare state. And so, and that was part of the consensus out of World War II, is that in order to prevent, like, that income inequality was a major source of social upheaval and disruption. And so, yes, you could have private property rights, you could have private ownership of the means of production, but you also were going to finance this massive welfare state at the same time in order to kind of keep the peace. That was kind of their version of the bread and circuses.
So, on that front, the next point that I have is Keynesianism or neoliberalism is the driving economic policy depending on the decade.
Yeah.
So you have, for example, obviously 1930s, very Keynesian, right?
Yep.
40s, very Keynesian. But by the time you get to, basically like Reagan and Thatcher in the 70s and 80s, in the UK it was, late 70s, you see this shift towards a more neoliberal, not quite Austrian, but certainly somewhat influenced by the Chicago School of economics. And then by the time you get into the 90s, you see slowly a return of Keynesianism, certainly after the dot-com crash and then after the 2008 global financial crisis. You definitely see a return to Keynesianism.
Well, but I would say that, because we could get into a whole debate about this one. But generally speaking, what you saw within Western countries is capitalist economies with varying degrees of large social welfare states.
The way that I would put it is free markets through the framework of post-New Deal politics.
Okay, sure.
So, not Soviet style, collective
central planning.
Yeah. They're not doing North Korea, but they're not doing free markets in the way that Milton Friedman would advocate.
No. Yeah. And then, dollar hegemony, this is the world's reserve currency. Yeah. And again, what the world's reserve currency was meant to do is one, to facilitate greater trade, but it also ends up being kind of a hedge. Because if you are the world's reserve currency and somebody starts acting out, you have an enormous amount of power over their economy without ever sending over a bomb, a troop, anything. And so this was also part of this international order that was going to provide stability, because as long as you behaved, you were able to fully operate within the international trading markets. The moment you didn't, well, we took that privilege away from you, and now we see how much you like that. Like, do you want to get back into the international order, or do you want to keep screwing around, right? So that was part of the reason for that.
What that's bled into is hyper-financialization.
Yes.
So we've talked a little bit about this before. In 1945, the United States was a manufacturing superpower, but because of Bretton Woods, because of the dollar status as the global reserve currency, we end up running into what they call Triffin's dilemma. And the Triffin dilemma basically says a reserve currency issuer like the United States cannot maintain that status without exporting its industrial base to the rest of the world, because how else are you going to end up getting
because the way to kind of
they have to run a current account deficit.
To overly simplify that is, we get the benefit of being able to print more dollars, right? The rest of the world gets the benefit of actually us exporting a lot of our manufacturing, because the only way they can get the dollars that they need to trade, especially in certain commodities like oil, is they got to get dollars. Well, how do they get dollars? They sell stuff to Americans. We pay for it in dollars. Now they have dollars. Now they buy their oil, whatnot, right? So that's a very, very rudimentary explanation, but it kind of explains why there's this process of American manufacturing going to other places. That's not the only reason, but it is one of them. And how that ends up working
out.
And
before 1945, the United States was getting rich not because of, insurance or moving, money around on spreadsheets. It was because we were making stuff.
Yeah.
And so money was being invested into the real economy, not in, speculative, not, again, that's what hyper-financialization is, right?
Yeah.
And then the last point that's underpinning all of this really is the debt-based fiat system. That is definitely post-war consensus. That did not exist before. I mean, really, it didn't exist until 1971, but you could, I mean, certainly before the World Wars, you had, yes, the British pound was the reserve currency, but that was backed by gold, with the exception of they dropped it during World War I and then came back into the 1930s onto the gold standard. But again, when you look at the grand scheme of history, you did not have fiat currency systems lasting long. I mean, temporarily, crisis of the third century, right?
Sure.
But like, vast majority of history, currencies were not fiat based.
It's not sustainable.
Yeah.
Every fiat currency, and again, fiat currency just means that it's backed by nothing except the government says so. Like, the government has the ability to print, to tax, and to use force. That's what it's based on. That's it, right? There's no gold, there's no silver, there's no anything else that's backing it. And and they are all inherently unstable. Like, there's never been a fiat currency that hasn't eventually collapsed. So
that's it. That's what the post-war consensus is. I mean, in a nutshell, these are a set of values, ways of being, behaviors, belief systems that largely, some of them might have existed before 1945 here and there, but they did not gain universal acceptance in the West as kind of the default until 1945.
Well, it was not the order that was good. So World War II created very, very specific conditions that made it possible. And that's, so again, if you look at it this way, we had just had World War I, which was devastating, right? And that's why they called it the war to end all wars. They were so convinced that who could possibly want to engage in this kind of industrialized warfare for what essentially amounted to no real territorial changes. Like, it's not just that World War I was so bad with respect to casualties. It's that it was so bad with respect to casualties and nothing really being resolved other than Germany was defeated, right? That Germany was defeated and the Austro-Hungarian Empire ceased to exist.
I mean, the French would be like, we got Alsace-Lorraine back.
Yeah, but we're talking about a relatively small piece of territory, right? It's
for millions of deaths.
Yes. And so everybody is looking at this going, why the hell would anybody do this? And 20 years later, right? Like, we're right back at it, baby. Right. So, and when the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, here's another important thing to remember. While World War I kind of changed some things about the international order and certainly impacted Germany very, very significantly and Austria very, very significantly. It's not as if like all of France, all of the UK, Russia obviously had massive upheaval due to the Soviet Revolution, the Communist Revolution. But there was still, manufacturing base. The British had the empire, the whole deal, right? After World War II, Europe was largely left in like ruins. The manufacturing base of every single major U.S. competitor had been decimated. And the United States had relatively been left untouched with respect to our country, with respect to our soil, our manufacturing base, everything else. So not only were we an economic juggernaut going into World War II, but coming out of World War II, we were kind of, I don't want to say we were the only game in town, but there was no question. I think we reached a point where we were like 25% of the world's manufactured goods. I mean, that's insane. And so you have this combination of, yes, the Allies won, but every other nation lost either millions of people and had their industrial base just bombed to the Stone Age. That's an exaggeration, but you get it. Plus, you have the drawing of the lines between the Soviet Union and the Western world. And here's the United States. We are the most powerful militarily, we are the most powerful economically, and we're the only ones that got the bomb for a relatively short period of time. So it made absolute sense that the United States would kind of take on this leadership role of the West. And then when you see things like the Marshall Plan, right, which again, I think the Marshall Plan is treated a little bit more friendly than it should be, but it also created this environment where a lot of Western countries became, at least for a small period of time, kind of dependent on U.S. aid. And part of the reason why that U.S. aid was given was to keep them within our sphere, to keep them within our orbit and not the Soviets. And so once Europe kind of became solidified and the battle lines were drawn, now the rest of the world was up for grabs, right? And that's where you see things going on in Africa. That's where you see things going on in South America. That's where you see things going on in Asia. And you see those lines being drawn. And because of the threat of existential, nuclear war between the Soviet Union and the United States, a lot of these rules that were put in place kind of made sense, because regardless of what your frustrations were with them, the mindset was it's better than nuclear war with Russia. And then the Soviet Union dissolves without a major global conflict. And a lot of people can justifiably look at that and be like, it worked.
That's why Francis Fukuyama wrote his book when he did. Right.
It worked. But now people are looking at it going, okay, and maybe it did. Now, again, there's some critiques. Was it nuclear weapons? Was it the rules-based order? Was it all these other things? What really contributed? What didn't contribute quite as much? But largely, it feels like it worked. And now people are looking at it going, okay, but does it still work? And that's the next part we're going to get into here, is this whole idea of why is this post-war consensus collapsing? And again, we have a variety of reasons, some of which you can probably already start to guess at. I think that when you look at, again, the absence of a major threat in the world, like the United States at this point is the only major, both military and economic, global hegemon. Now, some people, I can already hear people who go, what about China? There is no question that China has a great deal of economic capability. There's no question they have a very large military. There's no question that they're a nuclear power. There's no question that they've been doing saber rattling and they've been a force to be reckoned with within the region. China cannot project the same amount of economic or military force that the United States can, period, the end. It isn't close. It isn't close. And so again, if we don't see China as the looming threat that we saw the Soviet Union, well, then you start to ask questions. Do we really need NATO? Do we really need bases in well over 140 countries? Like, do we really need this? And what does it mean if we pull back? And everyone right now is like, well, wait a second. This is what we've operated off of for 8 decades. And look, for all of its flaws, we didn't have World War III. We didn't have nuclear holocaust, right? The borders have been relatively stable when you view it through the lens of the rest of world history. There has been no Mongolian horde. There's been no, so why are we walking away from this? And part of the answer for a lot of Americans is because Well, I understand why it's working for you guys. We don't know that it's working for us anymore. It used to be that there was things that we might have been willing to sacrifice in order to maintain a coalition around an existential threat. But if the existential threat is gone, and now you're relying upon us to subsidize your welfare state by not having your own military, why are we doing this? You know,
the biggest problem, I mean, and this is where we actually really need to talk about some of the philosophy that goes into this.
Yeah.
When you and I were talking about this topic, you brought up to me Karl Popper.
Yeah.
And the context on this is that Karl Popper was, I believe he was Austrian.
Yeah.
He was and he worked actually mostly in the sciences, but he had a few takes on philosophy, and he wrote this book, at the end of World War II, called, I believe, the Open Society and Its Enemies.
Yeah.
Notice how he put "and its enemies" in there. And Popper's thesis basically is that there's two types of societies that can conceivably exist. One is an open society, and one is a closed society. Closed societies are typically dominated by something that makes it unique or different from others. There's a defining feature that closes it off from the rest of the world. So it could be race, it could be religion, it can be ethnicity, tradition, culture. There's something about it that makes it very different from the rest of the world, and that thing is not touched or meddled with within the society. And so it's not. It's very easy for those type of societies to become tyrannical or totalitarian, even in the extreme case, or just oppressive to varying degrees. And so throughout history, he would argue that most societies, the vast majority of them, are actually closed societies. They're theocracies, they're monarchies, they're, once you get into the modern era, sometimes they become dictatorships, or in the absolute worst case scenarios, they become, 1984 style totalitarian regimes. North Korea, Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union under Stalin. And so he's arguing that, well, we need open societies. Open societies are ones that are not defined by these traits that can produce authoritarian or, God forbid, totalitarian type states. And so he's looking at history, and he's actually critiquing, well, quite a few people in history, quite a few philosophers. He's critiquing everybody from Plato to Hegel, and saying that all of these individuals
Marx.
He critiques Marx as well. And he's saying that a lot of people can critique Marx, right? But he's saying that a lot of these guys are asking the wrong questions. They're starting with, well, what makes a good society? And he's instead arguing, well, what makes bad societies, and how do we avoid those things?
So there's kind of three things to understand about Popper. And we're going to go through this briefly because it does actually provide a moral framework that's going to make a lot of sense out of the stuff that we see. We asked that question early on. Why is it that whenever we get an argument with someone on the left, it always goes into "you're a Nazi"? There's a reason for that. So Karl Popper, again, writing Open Societies and Their Enemies, when he wrote it, you can be very sympathetic to the conclusions he's coming to. And one of the things he's advocating for is what you said before. It's this idea that, Plato focused on what makes for the good ruler. He focuses on what sort of government apparatus can you get that prevents tyranny. And this kind of makes sense because you look at the realm that he works in within science and the philosophy of science. He really focuses on falsification or deduction. It's the idea that you can't really know things for certain. That doesn't mean you can't know things to a degree, but you can't know for certain. And so this idea of using induction, where it's I'm going to stack up my evidence, and if my stack evidence is really high, then what I believe is right, and therefore we're going to do that. And he's saying, well, actually, it's kind of easier to look at it from an empirical standpoint of what makes it, what would make it wrong, what would make it incorrect. And this comes up with a theory that goes way beyond the scientific method and empiricism. It factors into what he thinks government should do. And so to your point, it's not that government is there to give everybody what they want. That's impossible because people want a variety of different things. If I ask 10 people what they want have for dinner, I'll get 10 different responses, but none of them want to starve to death. And so your government should be organized to prevent tyranny, not to provide the best ruler possible, to prevent tyranny. And what should your government focus on? Well, it can't focus on making everybody happy, so it should focus on preventing harm. Okay, great. What does that lead to? What is the framework? Well, we want an open society. Open societies are what? They are tolerant. They allow people to operate within the system through representative government. They're democratic. They work toward preventing harm, right? These are all the things that they're doing. They also avoid these kind of concepts of objective morality and objective truth. Now, he didn't completely reject objective truth, but he was very, very skeptical of a society that was built around this is the objective truth, because he felt that what that did was it gave the leaders of that country the moral authority to go out and conquer and spread this objective truth through the sword, tyranny. So we're not going to do that, right? Now, a lot of what we're hearing right now, it's like, okay, that makes sense. But here's the rub on some of this. If tolerance is going to be one of the key components by which you define an open society, can you tolerate the intolerant? And his answer was no. Now, that's what's called the paradox of tolerance. It was the idea that for a generally tolerant society to flourish, you can't tolerate intolerance. Now, on some level, and in a lot of the ways that Popper described it, it kind of made sense. Can you tolerate murder? Well, no, because then the murderers win, right? But does that mean you're intolerant now? And so he's like, well, no, there's general tolerance. But then when somebody is intolerant, that's when you use force. That's when you can use the state to prevent them from taking over your society and turning it into a closed society or an intolerant society. Okay, now I want you to think about this for a second, right? So tolerance is kind of one of these supreme ethics, but now there's a mechanism whereby you don't have to be tolerant because you can't tolerate the intolerant. But we're not going to go for like objective truth as to define society. We're going to go through this more of kind of like experimental society when we look at policy, because we're trying to prevent harm. And then the moral framework we're going to use is open society good, closed society bad. Well, if you're looking at the post-World War II consensus, who are the bad guys?
Hitler. Everybody's literally Hitler now,
But,
and that's how they justify being intolerant toward you.
Yes, because the moment if I really want to get something done, and I view myself as I'm a defender of the open society, and I really want to do this thing, and you're standing in the way of me doing this thing, and you mention God or objective morality or anything or tradition, well, you liked that military parade that Donald Trump did for the 250th anniversary of the Army? You know
you're a fascist.
You know who also liked military parades? Fascists. Oh, you believe in having closed borders? Well, you know who was also against immigration? Nazis. Oh, you believe in being patriotic and proud and nationalist? Oh, you know who also believed in that? You know, Hitler, right? And so the moment you are Hitler, the moment you're a Nazi, the moment you're a fascist,
you're not to be debated, you're to be destroyed.
You're not to, exactly. Why? The paradox of tolerance.
Well,
don't you understand?
All the rules go out the window, and now they've found an appropriate target for all of their vitriol and hatred and attacks and everything else. It's the same reason why that one freaking rich kid went and killed the insurance CEO, and all the leftists think he did a service. They're like on his side. They think he's wonderful for murdering that guy.
Yeah. Well, he was. Now you add all of this combined with what you see coming out of the Frankfurt School and the oppressor-oppressed dynamic and everything, and all of a sudden now we have another mechanism whereby we can tell who we can tolerate and who we shouldn't tolerate. Because if you're an oppressor, I don't got to tolerate you. And it's funny because you'll see liberals on TikTok say, well, the next time your conservative family talks about the tolerant left, remind them about the paradox of tolerance from Karl Popper. Now, if you actually read Popper, Popper actually had a lot more constraints on this theory than the left currently applies. But the left's applying what works for what they're doing. So again, this post-war consensus of Hitler's the devil. If I want to do something and you're standing in my way, all I have to do to provide myself moral justification is you're a Nazi. And therefore now you're an enemy of open society. And now I can do whatever I need to in order to expel you or harm you within society or deplatform you, whatever it might be, because you're the threat.
It goes back to one of my favorite quotes, which is, whoever invokes humanity wants to cheat. By a different Karl.
Yeah.
But no, I mean, this is the problem with ultimately the philosophical underpinnings of the post-war system, of the post-war consensus, because it really is embodied. Honestly, if you think about it, the anthem of the post-war consensus is John Lennon's Imagine.
Yes, which is the worst song ever written by man.
It is the most depoliticized,
yes,
neutralized, open.
Well, here's the deal.
Nothing to live or die for, right? Nothing above or below. It's just horizontal leveling. It's just living for today. It is taking that to its logical conclusion.
Well, John Lennon wrote the words to Imagine. The left, using the post-war consensus, decided, why imagine it? Let's make it happen. And here's what they realized.
I hope one day you'll join us, or you're a Nazi.
Yeah. Well, and what they realize is not everybody wants to imagine that sort of world. Not everybody believes that. Not every, again, if you're going to if tolerance is going to be the supreme ethic, well, then what you end up finding out is that for all the talk and for all the bluster about, we're getting rid of like objective truth and objective morality because it's oppressive and it prevents you from being authentically you and it prevents you from achieving Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And this is what is causing wars, is that we're insisting on a particular moral order. Okay, but what you just described is a moral order. But based on what?
This is why there was a fatal flaw in the post-war consensus, which is that couple flaws. First one, it tried to depoliticize the things that it claimed was driving conflict in the past. Race, religion, nationality, identity, things that had demands placed upon you that you didn't get to choose, right? And so therefore, this is dangerous. Well, that same mindset is in many respects why the left attacks young white men for being young white men. They didn't choose their identity when they came into existence, but that's dangerous. This is fueling toxic masculinity and patriarchy and whiteness and these things that are fueling the oppressor dynamic. Well, but the problem is you're attempting to depoliticize things that, first off, give meaning to people, the nation, the family, religion. But the second thing is that the act of depoliticization is itself a political act. Mm-hmm. If you're going to go out there and declare, we will eliminate all political conflict, what does that require? Sovereignty. Yeah. That requires force. Yeah. That requires power. And how do you bring that about? Well, we need this technocratic elite. that is ultimately fueling what we call the managerial class. That is what's giving them their mandate from heaven, basically, to do the type of things that they do. And the worst thing is you cannot eliminate politics. You cannot eliminate politics in the way that Carl Schmitt envisioned it, of a conflict between friends and enemies. You can adjudicate the boundaries of that. We've done that all throughout history. Yeah. That's what the Treaty of Westphalia was attempting to do. But you cannot eliminate it. If you try to eliminate, if you say for a second, well, religion is fueling the friend-enemy dynamic, so we will eliminate religion from the public sphere, it will shift into race. And then you say, well, we will eliminate race as a component. It will shift into identity. Well, we will eliminate identity as a component. It will shift into nation states. We'll eliminate the boundaries between nation states. Eventually, it'll shift into gender roles. We'll eliminate the concept of gender. Well, then it'll shift into, eventually you will find yourself in a position where people will start shooting each other over mask mandates.
Yeah.
Well, but now you've got this youngest generation that has watched all this go down and go, this is just one big hypocritical self-licking ice cream cone. And they're like yearning for the Crusades again. And, they demonize the Crusades. The previous generations have totally demonized the Crusades. But then now this new generation is like, we shouldn't have stopped. Yeah. And we should, in fact, give us another crusade.
That's not the post-war consensus. That mindset is...
I know, but that's what I'm saying this young generation is rejecting it.
They are.
Well, in part because if you look at what Popper is offering up as kind of like the essential, it's just the openness component. It's individual liberty, which, again, I'm a big fan of. I'm a huge fan of individual liberty. But freedom, once attained, to do what? What most people find is that the things that give them the most value and meaning in their life are not their freedom. It's an underpinning, but ultimately it's your responsibilities, right? It's your family, it's your friends, it's your country, it's the sense of meaning and belief. It's God, right? It's having an objective framework for truth and morality, which can be relied upon, which can actually help you endure the difficult situations, the downturns in life. all of those things, which can give you consistent meaning and purpose regardless of what is going on around you. But if you reduce all of that to, well, hey, you're free and you can do whatever you want and you can claim to be whatever you want and nobody's allowed to make you feel bad about it. Okay, but that doesn't actually provide real meaning and purpose at the end of the day, right? Saying I'm going to free you from the boundaries of reality, it is not only not something that ultimately makes you feel safer or freer, it actually makes you feel a lot more confused. It makes you feel a lot more under threat because being able to properly interpret reality is actually a pretty critical part of successful existence. And so I think a lot of people are looking around going, oh, okay, sure. And it's not like, again, this is the dangerous part, right? Because this is where we got to go into the whole idea of, okay, what is it going to change into? Because there is one path which says, hey, let's learn some of the important lessons that we had from this experience. Let's understand why some of these things developed and why they might have been useful at one time and are not useful now, or why certain things might have appeared to be useful but weren't. And yet the third category of the things that are still useful, right? I don't want to throw out individual liberty, right? I don't want to, but I want to view it within a framework that actually makes sense, both with objective truth, objective morality, and human experience. By the way, speaking of consensus, why is the general consensus within the West right now that you as a parent have no business educating your child? That's something that needs to be handed over to the experts. And let's get more specific. When they talk about the experts, they mean the government experts. We all understand intuitively what is wrong with this idea of the government having a monopoly over something like, the media or news or journalism. Why do we not see the problem with the potential government monopoly over education? Now, sure, you might have private school. You might have other options out there, but sometimes you can't afford those, or you might be skeptical of what that private school is going to do as well. Well, Tina and I have actually sat down and gone through a 12-part series on an introduction into homeschooling. And we discuss our adventure through this. We've had all three of our kids go through homeschool. They've graduated. We talked about how we never intended to do it at first because we thought they were all weirdos. And then we found ourselves in a position where we had to do it for practical reasons. And then we put our kids back in. And then we immediately pulled them back out for different reasons. And we take you through that journey of going through the process of deciding to homeschool, adapting what we thought we were going to do with what we actually did, talking about what we thought we did well, what we thought we did poorly. But most importantly, we kind of get rid of some of these, the common objections, the common fears that people have, so that you can decide what is best for your children. So if you're interested in that, I want you to go down the link in the description. You can fill out a form there to be one of to be the first to get notified of when this series goes live. Now, this is so important to Tina and I that we decided we put all this together. Our team did a great job. It's going to be free. We just want people to be able to see these videos and, again, make their own decision for their own family from someone that is encouraging you to once again embrace the fact that you are a primary educator in your child's life and you do not have to surrender that to somebody else. Doesn't mean you can't get help from outside sources. Of course we do. But you never surrender the authority you have to be a primary educator in your child's life. And Tina and I talk about how we did this and the results that we had. And quite frankly, we're pretty happy with them. So if you want to learn more about that, go to that link in the description so we can send you that free intro into homeschooling. Okay, so the post-war consensus is, there's certain moral reasons. There's a lot of young people that, as Tina described, have kind of looked at it and found it wanting. And it's not that they all of a sudden want dictatorship. It's not that they want totally closed societies. They've just realized that some of these things, like the paradox of tolerance, has been conveniently weaponized against them the moment they do reach for the transcendent, right? The moment they do want objective morality and truth, and they're not having that anymore. They're fine to have a conversation, but they're not going to be told that they have to tolerate everything somebody else does simply because it's not, quote, hurting them, right? Especially because these post-war consensus countries have established these elaborate welfare states. We saw how USAID was taking our tax dollars in order to fund a very radical, transgender sexual ideology around the entire world. Well, you don't get to claim that's not hurting me when you used my money to do it.
And you know who else funds these type of things? George Soros with his Open Society Foundation.
He was a student of Popper.
He named his own organization that for a reason. But you're right that it is brought up, the internal contradictions that it has given birth to have gotten to a point 80 years later that it's too large to ignore anymore.
Yeah.
Liberalism in this post-1945 sense has gotten to a point where it is actually not liberal at all anymore. It is post-liberal. It's basically a post-liberal theocracy wearing a mask of liberalism, because it starts with, again, we're gonna eliminate these things from the public sphere that breed conflict. How are we gonna do that? Through force. And who's gonna be executing the force? The technocratic elite that know what's best. Okay, and what are we going to do to those who resist? We're going to delegitimize them morally and call them Nazis in order to justify what? Doing anything to them in the sake of bringing about the open society. Okay, so if anybody, well, what if I want, with my freedom to choose, what if I want to choose things that put upon me demands and ask me to sacrifice for them? Things like God, things like my family, things like love of my own country, patriotism. What if those are the things that I want to choose? You're not allowed to choose those things, because liberalism in the post-1945, post-war mindset has no tolerance for any sort of telos or any sort of belief system that places upon people who adopt it demands of itself.
I'm going to push back. I'm going to push back a little bit there, because most people are going to say, well, wait a second. I still live in a free country, and you know, I've been under the system for 80 years, and it's not like people are rounding me up because I've chosen to be a Christian or chosen to have a family. I think, but what we can say...
That's happening in Europe.
Well, but what we can say is that we're seeing this gradual push in that direction, right? When you have more people getting arrested for social media posts in the UK than they do in wartime Russia, right? That's problematic. When you can get put in prison for praying quietly outside of an abortion clinic, but by the same token, the other side can walk down Main Street and twerk half naked in front of a child in the middle of the street, and it's perfectly legal, and not only legal, but celebrated. People are starting to see inherent contradictions here, and they're looking at it going, well, wait a second, why is your view of tolerance the supreme ethic by where we have to like manage all of society? Right? That doesn't make sense. This seems to be destructive. And I'm not allowed to notice the destruction because you happen to like it, because you like to walk down Main Street with a ball gag and chaps, right? I'm supposed to just be like, oh, I guess that's perfectly fine, since it's not personally infringing on my property. But then you find out, oh, wait, yes, you were, because you used my tax dollars to fund it. You used the school systems, which are supposed to be neutral, in order to push it. Open society is not just the idea of I'm free to live my life, you're free to live yours. It is now pushing ideological objectives, which I find to be destructive towards society. And the old arrangement was, I don't compel you, you don't compel me. And what we found out is you weren't playing by the same rules. And you can just throw up this paradox of tolerance and justify any action. And so if that, and this goes to one of the points you make, if that is what this order leads to, I don't want it. And that's a fair critique. So the question is, what replaces it? Because you're right, we got some idiots that are on there, and you've pointed this out before, I think very well. And it's been this idea of, okay, you've dumped on me for decades now. I'm tired of being dumped on. You know, so I'm going to associate with whoever you don't like. Oh, you don't like Nazis? Like, okay, well, that's not a healthy rebellion to what we see going on here, because instead of saying, what is the good, what is the bad, what is the perversion of this overall effort that we were trying to achieve, you're just saying, I just want to be the opposite of you.
It's a pure negation. When you build metaphysics around a pure negation of something that you don't like, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily pursuing something that is good or true, right? It simply means you're pursuing a negation. But I would argue the negation actually began in 1945. Mm-hmm. We looked at 2 back-to-back world wars, and we said, we want the opposite of that.
Yeah.
And so what fueled this? Nationalism. Therefore, we're going to be post-national. Who fought it? Masculine men. So therefore, we're going to emasculate everybody and eliminate masculinity from the public sphere.
Working out is white supremacy. Yeah.
Oh, the defense that was made at Nuremberg is, I'm just following orders. We will dismantle any conception of hierarchy. Mm-hmm. We will dismantle any conception of loyalty, because those are things that the Nazis used in order to indoctrinate and create a centralized command structure through which they can actually perpetrate their atrocities. Oh. And so what happened I would argue, is that we took a set of values and belief systems that existed certainly all throughout Europe before 1945, and we said these things fueled World War I and World War II, and so therefore we are going to negate these values. But the problem is that what you end up getting is what we have today, right? That the Nazis weren't woke, and so what you have is attacks on the family. Why? Well, the Nazis they were pronatal. Obviously, for only their people, right? But like, so therefore, we're going to be antinatal.
Yeah.
The Nazis really emphasize masculinity, right? Nietzschean will to power, right? Go out, go forth and conquer and plunder. So therefore, we're going to emasculate men. We're going to demonize masculinity. We're going to create concepts like toxic masculinity. The Nazis were super racist, so we're going to elevate racism as the greatest sin you can possibly engage in.
Well, and also
is racism, right?
Which is why that same side can engage in rampant racism,
but only against whites.
Say it's not racism because of who I'm doing this to.
Yes,
it's not really racism.
Which is a really
because the Nazis were white,
right?
And so that's the only group that we can.
But there's another component here that we haven't brought up yet that's really, really important, right? Because there was something that slipped through in the post-war consensus, right? Because it was Nazis bad, totalitarian, authoritarian, brutal. Expansionist. Oh, you mean like the Soviets? And yet
they love communism.
The Soviets were on the Allies side. They were the good guys, right? They were part of the good guy team that won. And that's also what got smuggled into the post-war consensus is while Nazism appropriately got completely denigrated to the ash bin of history, communism was allowed to be elevated along with other elements. Even though we had the Cold War, you still had a strong leftist tradition within the West that were adamant about the idea that, well, okay, we're not saying we're Soviets. We're just saying that, we like what Karl Marx had to say about the labor theory of value, or we like what he had to say about exploitation of labor. And so the moment the Soviet Union fell, the boogeyman that represented communism went away, and the left immediately went to rehabilitating communism. And after all, since the Soviets were part of they fought the fascists. They're Antifa, and we all know that the chief evil in society is the fascists. The chief evil is the Nazis, not the Russians. They were the good guys. And so when you look at that, when you look at this idea of the post-war consensus, and then you smuggle in leftist ideology, which is rooted in Marx around critical theory, oppressor-oppressed dynamics, well. You can see where these battle lines are now drawn, because one of the authoritarian societies didn't get branded that way, even though they very clearly were by any sort of metric that Popper would have used, and yet Marx still survives.
You can fly a hammer and sickle flag in New York City and get away with it. Try flying a swastika in Times Square and see what happens. Like. A good example is the Canadian trucker convoy protest in 2022.
Yeah.
There was like one guy that came up with a swastika banner, and obviously the media immediately, this is a Nazi protest. They have this phrase, if one guy showing up to your rally with a swastika, then you're at a Nazi rally. But you see left-wing protests all the time where people are flying hammer and sickle banners, and you don't see people saying, you're all Marxist, totalitarians that want to kill everybody.
Yeah.
Like there is absolutely a double standard at play where one set of symbols can be displayed in public all day long and it's just considered, that's just extreme leftism. But then another one is, this is morally evil. It's not even far right. It's just, this is, absolute evil. You can't get any more evil than this.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's, I think, in part because ultimately the Marxists won World War II on the Eastern Front in Europe.
Yeah.
And so the Nazis lose, but it's not like liberal democracy wins. They halfway win.
Yeah.
And they fight the Cold War, and yes, they win the Cold War, but what happens is that Marxism, the Marxist framework can simply be repurposed towards, what Antonio Gramsci ends up proposing, and you end up getting cultural Marxism by the time you get to the 21st century.
Well, and that's, and one, again, the thing that we need to understand is this idea of just an open society for its own sake. doesn't have the moral juice to sustain itself.
That's an even bigger problem than the Marxist component.
Well, but think about what I'm talking about here, right? The reason why it can't win ultimately is because people do yearn for transcendence. They yearn for meaning and purpose. And just being an open hedonist, turns out it doesn't provide that. The most depressed people you will find are not the ones toiling at subsistence level to support their family. The people that you will find that are like the most miserable are the people that have actually attained the level of comfort and, access to wealth or technology that they thought would make them happy and have left them completely empty because they built their life around this notion that if I only had these things that would make me happy, then I'd be fine. And when they get them all and they realize I'm still not happy, they're the ones that descend into absolute depression because they feel like they made it and it was all false. So if we understand this about human nature, now again, from the Christian worldview, for us, it's very simple. We were created to worship, right? We were created to have, community with God. And so does that mean, if we look at the domestic component of the post-war consensus, does that mean that we want a state-run theocracy where, a particular religious leader runs everything? No, that's antithetical to our worldview. Do we want to not have individual liberty? Do we want to have a super state which dictates our every action and what we can do and how we? Absolutely not. So no, we still want individual liberty. We still want individual freedom. Do we want a legal system that uses a set of transparent rules in an attempt to try to get to a just outcome? Absolutely. Do we like the idea of some form of representative government? Yes. So there's a lot. Do we like the idea of human rights? Do we like the idea of treating people like, I don't want to completely exclude you from a group, but I do also want to appreciate your individual liberty, your bodily autonomy. I don't want to say that none of these other factors matter, but by the same token, I don't want to entirely define you by those factors. These are all positive components. But if it's going to be what this now means is that I can't make any sort of observations about objective reality, about what a man is versus what a woman is. I can't make any sort of objective moral decisions about whether or not it's appropriate for somebody to dress up in drag and twerk in front of a 7-year-old. I can't make any moral pronouncements about whether or not it's a good idea to drug a gender-confused 10-year-old. No, I don't accept that. And what's the clear line of division there? I have a transcendent moral authority in the form of God, which says there are certain rules. Now, that doesn't grant me the ability to impose all of those rules on you, but if you are going to engage yourself in certain ways that harm children or do other things, I absolutely have a right to intervene. And even if I recognize that the state does not have a role to force you to live the way I wish you would, right? That does not mean I can no longer have an opinion on the way somebody else should live. This is one of the things that bothers me about a certain strand of libertarianism where they treat like as long as it doesn't harm someone else's person or property, therefore it's good. No, I can come to the conclusion that not all things need to be criminalized without coming to the conclusion that all things are good and virtuous. So what's the difference between where's the post World War II consensus order I would like to go in? I would like to go into the idea that yes, individual liberty is important, but so is family. Yes, it's important for you to be able to be free to make your own choices, but you also need to bear the responsibilities for your actions. The state doesn't come in and use my tax dollars to prop up every bad decision that you have. And yes, I might be willing to at the same time say that the church should not run the state, but that doesn't mean the church gets to the state gets to eliminate the church from matters of public discord or even public policy. So that's the boundary I draw between what the post-war consensus has been driving toward. And it's like, look, you can go this far and you cannot go any farther on the domestic stuff. I mean, that's, again, when we talk about where are we going from here, I think what you're actually going to see is a return that's a little bit closer to this idea of the American Revolution instead of the French. I'm not giving up my Constitution. I'm not giving up limited government. I'm not giving up individual liberty, but I do want to add the concept, at least a social concept, a coherent social concept of virtue and the good to go along with the freedom. And I'm certainly not going to act as if any sort of action that you take is automatically good for yourself, society, or even me, simply because you might not have been directly using force to impose it. It's what we did at 1776. We hold these truths, not these convenient principles that we think are important for an open society. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created, not just a manifestation of time plus chance plus matters, with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is a framework for ordered liberty. And
it requires a theological underpinning to it.
Yes. And people don't want to hear that.
Absolutely right, because what happens when your conception of liberty is drag queen story hour, is walking around naked in San Francisco? Like, if your worldview produces San Francisco, your worldview is, in my opinion, it's evil and needs to be destroyed.
Well,
well, they use freedom of speech as the excuse to do all of these things, but if you say the wrong thing, they're not about freedom of speech at that point.
Well,
because again, like what we are living.
I think there are certain decisions people should not be allowed to make.
I
am fine with a certain amount of, this is a bad decision. You don't get to make that decision. You know
what we are currently living under, and it's become readily apparent, particularly I think since COVID, since 2020, is we now live in a theocracy whose founding mythology is that it liberated us from theocracies.
Yeah.
And which is why it acts the way that it does towards anybody that it associates with the right, with what they call fascists.
It's like an excommunication, like a religion.
Because it's you are engaged in heresy against the regime, you are engaged in blasphemy.
Well, the way they determine heresy is the paradox of tolerance, right? You are now outside of the realm of acceptable thought within an open society, and so therefore we will use the power of the state to punish you as a result. But those are the components of the domestic. Now let's look into the components of the foreign policy. So again, the foreign policy, we talked about things like the fiat currency. We talked about things like America being the reserve currency, everything being a drive toward liberal democracy for every country, whether you like it or not. NATO, UN, World Bank, rules-based international order. The question becomes, what are the things are there any things to keep within the foreign component of the post-war consensus? And this is one where
I think we need to start taking land. I think anytime a country gets itself into too big of a snafu and we've got to come help, we get a little something for that. And then I also think when a country starts saber rattling and deciding to, cause trouble, if we've got to go bomb a few nuclear facilities, we're also going to take some oil.
So the problem with this is I don't want to be bringing more people into my country that don't share my values and don't want to.
Can we agree on this? We don't want to go back to the conquest ethic.
Well, Tina apparently does.
Well, Tina does.
No.
We don't want to go back to the conquest ethic of, I can take your stuff because I'm stronger than you. Like, that's not what we want. And so if you don't want that, then there does need to be some sort of international rules-based order. The question is who enforces it?
I like the idea of it being proportional, especially the Reagan style proportional.
Well, okay, so
no, I like the idea of going, oh yeah, you went ahead and invaded here. Okay, we're taking all of that now. That's ours now. And I'm not saying they become Americans. I'm saying we push them off that patch of land and push them back into a smaller territory. And we just take it.
I could just see a situation where every politician that now wants to take land, as you suggest,
be like, you want ethnic cleansing?
I can't believe oh my gosh, they attacked our ship. How do you know? Trust us, they did. We now own this, right? Like, that's the problem with what you're saying, is that the way it gets applied is that, like, so for instance, we used to have war reparations, right? It used to be that if you started trouble, based off of the kind of like general rules of, you start the war, you lose, you pay.
Yeah, just like if you sue somebody or have a lawsuit against somebody, you've got to pay their legal fees if you lose. I feel like, if they lose, go ahead. You can go ahead and try to attack us. That's fine. But we're going to take whatever you've got as payment for the for the inconvenience of having to use our stuff.
I have been struggling with the idea of, again, I don't like the fact that Western European countries have largely allowed their militaries to kind of be mothballed in order to support an elaborate welfare state, because the United States military was going to be the predominant military power that would maintain the international rules-based order. And part of the reason for that was because, and somebody joked about this on X, he goes, as a German, let me see if I understand this correctly. You want Germany to come up with a really strong military in order to go through Poland to attack Russia? Just want to make sure I'm getting this right. Because the answer for a long time was, no, that's the last thing we want. We don't want Germany and France and Poland and Russia and the UK and Italy all rearming to the max, because every time they did it, they fought each other. Like if you look...
But maybe if they were fighting each other, they wouldn't be opening the floodgates and destroying their own society. They might be actually defending their society. Now that they're no longer defending their own societies, they've been so watered down that they've lost every single ounce of culture they ever had. And I'm just saying, maybe if they were fighting each other, they would be finding things to fight for again.
I get what you're saying. Look, here's all I'm saying. I'm trying not to be flippant about this. I've come to the conclusion, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but I've come to the conclusion that either way, it isn't our responsibility. And as much as I don't want to see European countries constantly engaging in conflict with one another, I don't believe it's the responsibility of the United States in order to maintain such an apparatus that it never happens. And part of that is because, to Tina's point, is horrible as the various wars that Europeans have fought with one another are. And I am not advocating for the moral, the moral benefits of a martial society in conflict. But it is pathetic to see what is happening in Europe right now, where you are essentially watching a soft invasion of their country, and so many of their men don't even have the courage to stand up to it.
No.
Because
they just hand their daughters over.
Wait a second, because they've all been taught that that's bad. That's what causes wars. I got news for you, brother. There's something worse than war. Living in a society where someone can softly invade your country and rape your daughter, and you've got to be worried about it because you don't want to appear to be racist. I don't know what kind of society that is, but I don't want to live in it.
Well, it's not one that's going to last much longer.
It isn't. And this is the part where it's our event, again, the aversion toward harm as the way they've defined it. And war is always bad. And I see this within our own culture right now. And I see it within certain sectors of the right that I tend to agree with. It's like, you're right, war is bad. I don't want war. Please hear me. But I also don't want a society that's so afraid of it that they're willing to surrender to just about anything in order to avoid it. And there has been this cultural rot and decay. And again, I give J.D. Vance an incredible amount of credit for this. When he spoke at the Munich conference, he's like, you guys are all looking at Russia like this is the great existential threat that we're facing right now, and we need support in order to fight it. And J.D. Vance is looking at him and goes, do you have a population even willing to fight?
No, they don't.
Do you have a population even willing? And if you ask them, what are we fighting for? What would they say?
Well, there's this.
They're fighting for the open society.
There's this understanding now that all fighting is just bad. And the problem is sometimes you're not, sometimes you're fighting against something because you're fighting for something else. And when your society has been told over and over and over again that everything your society was built on is bad, then now you no longer have anything to fight for. They're even telling you family's bad. They're even telling you gender roles are bad. Everything's bad. And so there is nothing to fight for anymore. And so they're not fighting to the death in a war. Instead, they're just slitting their own throats.
Well, here's what's amazing. Why are you fighting? Well, we're going to fight to protect the integrity of Ukraine's borders. You guys don't even believe in protecting the integrity of
inspiring.
your own. Well, no, you don't even believe in protecting the integrity of your own borders.
They don't believe in
You're
borders.
you're not fighting Putin because he violated the integrity of Ukraine's borders or Ukraine's national sovereignty. You're fighting him because you've been told he's Hitler. And that's the only thing you've got to go on anymore. The post-war consensus. Which one's Hitler in this conflict? That's the one I oppose. Okay, here's a rifle. Go fight. Oh, what? I'm not going to go fight. This is the part where, again, when I look at the foreign policy component, I think the United States needs to keep a couple of things in mind. And this is something I'm saying to the right too, especially the quote anti-war right. I despise the term anti-war. I really do. Because I'm not for war, but what do you mean you're anti-war?
But sometimes war is the answer.
That's my point,
Yeah.
right? It's what are the conditions? I'm certainly not pro war for war's sake. I'm certainly not pro rushing into war because you feel like it, right? I'm not for any of that. But to say I'm anti-war is a little bit like saying I'm anti-killing. Okay, well, let me ask you a question. If someone comes into your house determined to kill your family, are you going to kill them? If the answer is no, you're a coward. And quite frankly, you're worthless.
And that's where we are in this society. I don't know if you guys have seen the video of them asking all these mothers whether or not they would kill for their child. Like if it was your child or this person, would you kill for your child? And almost all of them that were asked in this video were like, "Oh, I couldn't do that." Da, da, da. And I'm like, I will 100% straight up kill for my kids. And if you're a mom and you wouldn't, you don't deserve to be a mom. You probably murdered like 8 of your kids before you actually let one live.
So on the foreign policy, I think when we talk about the principles that we've talked about before on American first foreign policy, I think we need to go back to the idea of we're not isolationists, but we're also non-interventionist unless there's either a clear and present danger to the United States or one of our established allies that we actually have a signed legal treaty with. And we need to be careful on who we sign legal treaties with. That needs to be reevaluated significantly, like today. I'm not saying we need to pull out all of our bases from around the world, but I do think we need to draw down at this point. And
our foreign policy needs to be dictated by what is in the best interest of the United States and her people, not what is in the best interest of an ideology. And that's what it has been for decades.
I agree with that. But the other thing, too, is I don't think that means that you take out any sort of sense of objective morality. So the only thing I'll say in that is that I don't. The thing I occasionally struggle with on some of these issues is, again, when is it appropriate for the United States to get involved in a particular issue militarily? And the question is like if, I just think it's a more complex question than, hey, if it suits us, we'll do it. Obviously, our interests have to be our paramount consideration. Because as much as I can look at things and say that's horrible, okay, fine. I can donate to a cause, or I can go over myself and fight in that cause if I want. That doesn't mean I should subject somebody else's kids to go fight in that cause. And I do think that we need to take that into consideration when we're talking about the deployment of U.S. troops. But as I look at everything that just happened in the Middle East, I think we can argue on the margins, but overall, I think Trump was actually pretty judicious in analyzing a threat, using the appropriate level of military force to mitigate the threat, and then to try to facilitate peace as quickly as possible. I would like to see a U.S. foreign policy that is that. We have some people that want to see a U.S. foreign policy where we just don't get involved in anything, and I think that I don't know that always makes sense. I think there's times where U.S. military involvement can actually be in the best interest of the United States, and I don't just mean protecting us from foreign invasion. I mean, there are things within international trade and everything else where it makes sense for the United States to still have a strong military presence. Not every war is our issue. We don't need to be changing other countries. This is the big difference in the foreign policy that I want to see. Our job is no longer to make the world safe for democracy. That is not our job. That is not our moral imperative. Our job is to use our military to protect us and our allies to the extent that it makes sense for U.S. interests. But we're not the world's police force anymore. We're not the world's sugar daddy anymore. None of that.
On that third point, because these actually interlock a little bit. On the economic front,
yeah,
you missed the episode where we talked about this,
yeah.
but we have to undo the hyper-financialization of our economy.
I agree.
Now, we can debate all day long whether or not tariffs are the means to do that, but this is becoming a serious problem when the American economy is almost entirely run at this point by green line go up on the stock market.
Yeah.
And, I think it was Nick Land, actually. He had a tweet a few months ago where he was like, I'm not really sure that Team Blue here realizes that infinite debt and zero industrial capacity is not a recipe for economic success.
Yeah. You're not going to, if you really are going to pivot back to the whole like workers of the world unite, it's pretty hard when you've made it impossible to have any workers.
They don't want that actually. It's more that like, there's this brand of progressivism that is upper middle class that's like, I want my cheap stuff from China and I want green line to go up because my house that I bought for the price of 5 blueberries in 1973 has gone up $1 million, but I'm really upset at Jerome Powell because he could make it $2 million.
Yeah.
And this idea that the economy is just going to be fake numbers and money printing.
Yeah.
And that we're just going to be able to perpetually import whatever we need from China or India or Vietnam. Like, you cannot do that forever. You have half the country right now that are sitting in places like the Rust Belt that are in open revolt against the Democratic Party, who they used to be a loyal voting bloc for because they realize the system has been rigged against me. I cannot think of a more cruel and selfish economic decision than upper middle class progressive managerial types voting to outsource manufacturing to the rest of the country, establish a fiat currency system that creates a hyper-financialization within the economy so that way they can make boatloads of money investing in the stock market at the same time that they've exported the jobs to other parts of the world. And then again, you're sitting in one of these coastal enclaves, right? You're sitting in Seattle or New York or Los Angeles, and you're doing great.
Well, can we
again, if you're in Ohio or Michigan or Indiana, you've just been decimated from that exchange over the last 50 years. Your own government has betrayed you.
But here's what I get worried about. The economic one, this is the one that we're going to have to be the most careful about. Because I can already see massive amounts of people on the right that believe that tariffs are what lead you to prosperity, that believe that economic regulation and protectionism is no, it isn't. No, it freaking isn't. All right. Bastiat was right. Friedman was right. Sol was right. No, it isn't. The only reason why these things are actually providing some sort of utility right now is because of the monetary order that we've adopted. If we could get back to sound money, if we could get back to less government regulation, if we could get back to lower taxes, I have no doubt that you would see a resurgence in both the creation of actual goods and services and entrepreneurship in this country. But instead, what have we done?
It would crash the fake economy, though. If
it would,
did that.
The people that would hurt the most would be the people that are heavily invested in the stock market, right? Because we do have a heavily speculated economy. But the point is this is what I want people to understand. It's like, please, please, please don't learn the wrong lessons. Because what I'm seeing is that the problems are a little bit harder to get to. But the caricatures are really easy to understand. What's the problem? Oh, we exported our manufacturing. How do you do it? Protectionism and tariffs. No, the way you do it is you make it easier to produce in the United States, and you don't have you don't have a monetary policy which makes it impossible to do that. You don't have a monetary policy which encourages the exportation of all your manufacturing, right? But the only way, again, when I look at the biggest thing that I want to see change from the post-world order on the economics, if I can only pick one, it would be a return to sound money.
I agree, but that would trigger a Great Depression type event, right? You would see asset prices collapse 80%, right? You'd see home prices collapse.
Well, it depends
the stock market
collapse. On how you move toward a sound money. Like, I'm not saying I would do it. Okay, tomorrow gold standard. I'm not saying that. But there has to be a process. And here's the most important part. People have to understand why the process is the general public needs to hopefully learn why we're doing the things we're doing, to disengage from what we have been doing and to reinitiate sound money policies. And you're right. If you just crash the economy overnight, you're going to get a violent rebellion. So you can't do it that way. There has to be a gradual process. But I would love it if we actually had a vocal movement toward, hey, here's the process that we're going to use to move towards sound money. And then what you do is people have an opportunity to start moving around assets into things that make sense in preparation for that.
You're seeing this already with gold going up,
Yes.
Bitcoin going up.
The problem is that, and you're going to love this, you're going to love hearing me say this. The problem is that it's almost impossible to do with representative government. You would actually have to have somebody that had enough. You would have to have a sovereign that could just say, this is what screwed this up. And this is going to be our 5-year approach, or not even, you couldn't even say 5 years. You just have to say, this is going to be our multi-year approach to achieving X. But it's happening, and I will make it happen through force.
I've never seen an example of a democracy correcting itself from fiscal ruin. Because, I mean, the old line about how democracies vote to pillage the public treasury is absolutely correct. Like, there is a built-in incentive structure for which politician is going to sacrifice their political career to balance the budget. Like that, there is no incentive to be prudent with the public finances when you're up for re-election every 2 years.
Yeah, well, and
that's
then,
a problem for the next generation. Like my biggest problem is like you get people all the time that say things like, you know, politicians have absolutely failed to solve this problem. No, they haven't.
Yeah,
they're doing a great job solving the problem. The problem for them is re-election.
Yeah.
We have a 96, 97% re-election rate for the House and Senate right now. Politicians have done a phenomenal job solving the problem that they have, which is how do I get re-elected? 96% of them solve that problem every 2 to 6 years, depending on which chamber you're in.
Yes.
The actual problem, the meta problem here is the fact that this system, which is a component of the post-war consensus, is utterly unsustainable. We can debate all day long about the morality, the philosophy. There's plenty of intellectual arguments to be made about domestic affairs, about foreign policy, about questions of the open society. But on this question about economics, this is a pure mathematical fact that what we have is unsustainable and is going to produce perpetual inflation. We are either going to get, over the long period of time, I'm talking, a lifetime, you are going to get either a Weimar situation or you are going to get a Great Depression situation. It simply depends on whether or not you hyperinflate
but here's the
or
thing.
You collapse the
Let me tell you why
bubble.
I hate hearing we're going to get a Great Depression.
No, I don't think you're actually going to get that.
Well, but
because I think they're going to inflate.
No,
they're not going to.
Okay,
you're not going to get a credit.
That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. I hate it when people say, "Well, if you do that, you're going to get a Great Depression." Because what happens is people don't think we're going to have an economic downturn. People think we're going to have what the Great Depression was, and they think the Great Depression was a result of the stock market crash in 1929, and it wasn't. That was an initial catalyst. It was government intervention on top of it, where they tried to essentially engage in more central planning than we ever had in U.S. economic history at that point, that made a temporary economic downturn that had largely resolved much of its own problems within a year to a Great Depression that lasted over a decade. So no, you're not going to get the Great Depression. You're not going to, You're not going to get the Great Depression. What you're going to get is a significant economic downturn. The question will be in that point is, how quickly do we allow the market to respond to it? And if you allow the market to respond to it, you are not destined to a multi-decade depression. You could potentially be out of it and growing pretty steadily within a relatively short period of time. And I'm talking like single-digit years, right? So
the Great Depression, using the term Great Depression with regard to economics, is kind of the equivalent of using the term Nazis.
Briefly, here's the argument for why I think, and I don't think this is going to happen because I think they're going to inflate.
Okay, but that's not the point of what I'm saying, right? Like
when you've kicked the can, like there should have been a correction in 1987.
Yes,
but Greenspan was like, no, we can't have an economic correction. Green line's supposed to go up. And then there should have been one in 1999, 2000.
Yes.
Nope, can't have that. And then there should have been one in 2008.
Yeah.
No, you had Ben Bernanke with QE. And so what has happened now, we are 50 years plus into this experiment.
Yes.
If you had a correction in the form of the collapse of the fiat currency system, yes, that would be a Great Depression because it would be.
You got to do the wrap up. We got to wrap up.
It would be a Great Depression because you have so much so much fake wealth that's built upon debt that's not actually real.
Christian.
But that's a whole other
that's not what
discussion.
this podcast is
Christian,
about.
when you
discussion
use
for
the
another
term Great Depression, you're not just referencing a large-scale economic downturn, which would be inevitable. I agree with you. You are referencing a particular point in American history that everyone associates with certain things. And what I'm saying is that the Great Depression never had to happen. 1929, a massive. We had we had big problems in 29 with over-speculation within the stock market, right? But we also had a different monetary order at the time. So now what you're combining is over-speculation with bad monetary order, which has actually encouraged this sort of behavior. So yes, you get a worse situation than 1929. What I'm saying is that
I know where you're going.
If in that moment you allow the market to adapt, right? You don't need to be in it, and it's not decades of depression. You could theoretically be out of something like that in 4 to 5 years. And that's all I'm saying, is that I don't want to give people this impression that it has to be 1930s America. It doesn't. It will be bad. It has to be, because you have to have a correction.
And what I think we would both agree on is that no politician would allow that to happen. So instead, you're going to get 1920s Germany.
Well, what you'll have is sovereign debt crisis, and that gets far worse. All right, we got a couple of questions here that we're going to go with. Rendemule said, what about conversion to Bitcoin? Would that bankrupt the cartels? No, they would just buy Bitcoin. But the other thing, too, to keep in mind is that it's just not going to happen. There's not going to be a mass conversion, I think, even if there was a conversion to crypto, I don't think it would be Bitcoin, because Bitcoin's not inflationary. And so it would be very, very difficult in order to facilitate that. But you definitely will see countries moving toward cryptocurrency. The problem is they're probably going to try to run to a state-controlled cryptocurrency, which is even more dangerous than the paper fiat currency that they have now. But again, having said that, I'm not anti-cryptocurrency. I like the idea of private sector currencies.
Whitfield asked, would a federal fiat sales tax only, I think
he said a flat sales tax.
Federal flat sales tax only, no other federal taxes allowed, help move this in the right direction?
100%. If you, for a couple of reasons, if you move, first of all, sales taxes are generally the easiest to collect because it's collected at the point of sale. It also makes the most sense in people's minds to just do the sales tax at that one point. The other thing that it would do is that it would actually punish the government for engaging in bad fiscal policy. If you engage in bad fiscal and monetary policy, you will almost by definition get less tax revenue. And so the end result is that the government doesn't have as much to spend if they're not actually engaging in sound monetary and fiscal policy. Plus, you wouldn't need this massive IRS apparatus. You would still need something in order to, make sure that the people were paying it and not trying to dodge it. So that would still exist. But it's not like you would have this April 15th every time where you got to fill out all your taxes. So I love the idea of just a federal flat, constitutionally mandated federal flat sales tax. And that's what you get. That's the budget. And because the other thing that it would prevent is it would make it much more difficult to administer these massive welfare state programs. And I think what you would eventually get is a transition into more of a Singapore style system where the government mandates that you have a retirement plan, and they might provide they might provide cartelization within the markets where you can do certain index funds or whatever. But now your money would be going into a fund that you would have legal ownership over, not simply because the government says so, but because you have a contract with the person you have a fund over. And it would just be a much better system all around. So yes, I'm a huge fan. The only way that you can do it, though, is you have to either repeal or significantly modify the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. Because if you just try to institute a federal flat sales tax without modifying the 16th Amendment, you're going to end up with a flat sales tax plus an income tax, plus everything else they're doing. Yeah, but I love the idea of doing that. I think it would be really good. And again, I think we need a runoff period in order to get to sound monetary policy. But to Christian's point, I think the only way you would get that is you'd have to have somebody with almost near dictatorial powers, because there's no way Congress will do it because of the perverse incentives in the electoral system. All right. That's it. We have gone through a brief overview of the post-war consensus. We've talked about why it's collapsing and why people are rejecting it. And we've talked about the potential direction that we could go that doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that still keeps important components that I think most of us here in America still value, but recognizes that, look, we're just not going to live in a society where everything is this hedonistic quest to the top of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. People want transcendent. They want things that give them purpose and meaning. They believe in objective truth and objective morality, no matter how mad our education system trying to train it out of us. And the one thing that we've learned is that for all of this effort to try to keep an open society, the left doesn't believe in an open society. They want their version of a closed society. The right actually wants something far more akin to an open society. But one of the things that we've realized is you can't really have an open society if you got a bunch of people that don't want one. And so we're going to have to figure this out going forward. But the good news is this. Politics is going to play into this. But the way you actually get the sort of society that we're looking for right now is not going to be rooted exclusively on who you vote for. It's going to be rooted on how you raise your own children, how you educate them. So go check out that homeschool video Tina and I put together and see if that's something that you might be interested in, because we do answer a lot of the common questions on that. Not to mention the fact that we are going to be setting up another episode right now. We're trying to get Andrea back on. We're going to try to get the technical issues figured out, because we're going to talk about some of those cultural issues that we feel could lead back to strong families and thus a stronger country. Once again, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next episode.